My name is Willie Lightfoot, City Council Vice President, Chair of Public Safety, Youth, and Recreation. I am joined with our mayor as well as some other council members, Councilmember Lachey Harris, Councilmember Dr. Mitch Gruber, Councilmember Mary Lupien, Councilmember Michael Patterson. And at this time, I'll turn it over for this meeting to Madam Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, Council Member or Vice President Lightfoot. I definitely wanted to take a moment to introduce you to WilmerHale, a company that I became aware of through the African American Mayors Association, and am very impressed with their work in police reform and working with departments to reimagine policing across the country. Danielle Conley, who I had an opportunity to speak to last week, as well as her team, John Walsh and Brent Gurney and Alyssa, all who I had a chance to do a deep dive with this week. Wanted to bring them to you because I would love to be able to move forward with retaining them to help us as it pertains to reevaluating and reimagining policing in the city of Rochester. They can tell you more in depth about their background, but one of the things that really impressed me was their work with the Department of Justice under the Obama administration and reforming and holding police departments accountable and bringing forth reports and changes that need to take place. One of the things that they also explained was that a DOJ review takes years, and it's not something that's done overnight. And I don't believe that this is something that we can wait on. We need to start this process right now with reimagining policing and working with the Race Commission and others to get our police department where we want it to be as it pertains to community policing. So I am going to turn it over to Danielle to introduce the team, to give you their background, to talk about what they have done across the country and their work with the Department of Justice under the Obama administration, and let you ask them any questions that you may have, because I think that it's imperative that we all feel comfortable about engaging and moving forward as expeditiously as possible with the reforms that we want to take place, in getting someone in to really do a deep dive in the evaluation. I don't believe that we'll find a team that has more expertise than this team that I'm introducing you to right now. And I've done the work that they have done across the board in cities as well as in departments, and knowing what to look for. And so Danielle, I'll turn it over to you. You can introduce your team or have them introduce themselves, and then council can ask any questions that you may have. I did send the paperwork that you had sent me. It's just a quick overview of some of your work to council, so that they could see that as well, so they have a basis for the discussion today.
Great. And thank you very much, Mayor Warren, and thank all of you for taking the time to meet with us today. So as Mayor Warren mentioned, I'm Danielle Conley, a partner in the DC office of WilmerHale. And our team had the opportunity to speak with the mayor this week about ways in which our firm might be able to assist the city in the wake of the Prude incident, and specifically in light of the significant experience that we have in advising cities and law enforcement agencies on policing policies and practices, including in matters stemming from tragic police uses of force. Our work in this space has included counseling cities and law enforcement agencies seeking to reform their policing policies and practices, as well as guiding those cities through pattern or practice investigations conducted by the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. And we can give you more context regarding what we've done for cities and law enforcement agencies in these kinds of matters. But before we do that, I do want our team, John Walsh, Brent Gurney, and Alyssa Budias, to introduce themselves so you can get a sense of who we are, our backgrounds, and our deep experience in this space. And so I'll just kick it off. Again, I'm a partner in the DC office of WilmerHale, and I'm a co-chair of the firm's anti-discrimination practice. I rejoined WilmerHale in 2017 after serving as Associate Deputy Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice, where, among other things, I managed high-profile civil rights litigation and enforcement actions for the department, including policing cases. I was on the DOJ leadership team that worked closely with the Civil Rights Division on the pattern or practice case in Ferguson. and I worked on a host of DOJ policy issues stemming from the 21st Century Policing Task Force that President Obama stood up in the wake of the unrest in Ferguson. In particular, while serving in my role at the department, I worked closely with other senior officials in the White House, other senior officials in DOJ, including John, who's on the line, to develop the Department of Justice's protocol for responding to officer-involved shootings, and then to implement strategies to really carry out the department's community policing mission. Now, at the firm, I regularly conduct sort of sensitive internal reviews and internal investigations for all kinds of clients in the wake of high-profile discrimination incidents, allegations of discrimination, and other misconduct, including doing deep dive reviews of organizations' policies, procedures, practices, and trainings. And with that, I'll turn it over to John to introduce himself.
Thank you, Danielle. My career has been divided pretty much evenly between private practice and service as a federal prosecutor. And during the Obama administration, I was the United States Attorney for the state of Colorado and worked very extensively all across the state on issues involving police accountability, community-oriented policing through the COPS office, people like Ron Davis and others. And I worked very much with Danielle particularly in the last couple of years of the administration, because I was chair of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee of U.S. Attorneys, and Danielle and I, as a result, worked together on many of the things that Danielle was just describing. In addition to that, I want to flag two things for you or three things actually, that I think are notable. Earlier this year in private practice, I conducted an independent review of an incident involving the Aurora Police Department here in Colorado, not the Elijah McClain case that has become so prominent in months since, but another incident that resulted in a report that we're happy to share with you that was very critical of the police department's response to the prior misconduct incident, which we can get into at the appropriate time. In addition to that, I have experience with civilian oversight of police. I was actually vice chair of Denver's Public Safety Review Commission back in 2004, 2005. Actually, I was on the commission from 2003 to 2005. So I have some sense of the sort of accountability issues that I know that you and Rochester are wrestling with on the civilian side as well. And then the final thing I'll just mention quickly is that in the course of Colorado's legislative actions this year, to pass a police accountability bill, I worked pretty closely with the governor's office and also the state attorney general's office to make sure that that bill got through with a maximum degree of support. So I have a multiple cuts at this set of issues, and really would welcome the opportunity to work with Danielle and Brent to assist the city of Rochester in this situation.
With that, Brent.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brent Gurney. I'm a partner at WilmerHale in the Washington, D.C. office, also with Danielle. Before I came to Wilmer, I was an assistant U.S. attorney in Maryland, so a federal prosecutor that was under the administrations of Bill Clinton and George Bush, the last George Bush. At Wilmer, I've done a lot of things, including many sensitive investigations, as well as complex litigation in other matters. Pertinent here is that I represented, I've been involved in a number of pattern and practice investigations and relating to various police departments. The first involved Puerto Rico, which has the second largest police department in the United States because it's a state police with some 17,000 officers after New York City. And there we became involved in advising the governor and the government of Puerto Rico on how to reform the police department while negotiating with the Department of Justice Office of Civil Rights, which was conducting an extensive investigation of that police department, which had all sorts of issues running the gamut from mass protest issues and the way the police dealt with that to criminal corruption, to extreme brutality and other issues. After that, I represented Baltimore and their city council in the pattern and practice investigation that was launched by the Department of Justice following the tragic death of Freddie Gray in that city. There, the mayor invited in the Department of Justice to conduct a pattern and practice review. And we worked with the city to begin self-reform. Our advice, which was public, was that there was no reason for the city to wait. It needed to step out even while DOJ did its investigation because, as noted, they can last a long time. It should begin the reform process immediately. It needed to do that as a matter of good governance because the citizens needed it, the police department needed it, and it would be better to be on the front foot than waiting around for recommendations for the Department of Justice. That matter ultimately resulted in a negotiated consent decree with the Department of Justice. And by that, I mean a settlement agreement with the department that was entered as a court order in federal court, is overseen by a federal judge, and administered by a independent monitor. That agreement was entered into and entered in court just in the last minutes actually it was in the first few minutes of President Trump's administration. The Department of Justice under President Trump tried to walk away from the agreement. The federal judge involved rejected that attempt. And the judge cited our work, commended the work that we had done helping to come up with a blueprint for the city. Shortly after that, I represented Chicago, actually in parallel because that was going on with Baltimore, because they had a tragic incident involving Laquan McDonald, who was a young man who was shot in the back 14 times or so while carrying a knife. And that led to widespread social unrest in that city. The then Mayor Rahm Emanuel invited in the Department of Justice. They launched an investigation, which they completed in record time, which was a year. It seems like a long time, but that's a record for the Department of Justice. And they did it really in the face of the incoming new administration under President Trump. Our advice was very similar. One of the things that I'm most proud of with respect to that city is we helped them devise de-escalation training. That's a topic that's talked about a lot. And I know many police departments are adopting policies requiring de-escalation techniques, but those policies are not worth a damn if the officers are not trained on how actually to de-escalate situations, as we know all too well. The Trump administration then did disavow the entire investigation. Jeff Sessions famously said dismissed the Department of Justice as a report as a bunch of anecdotes and completely abandoned the field. And after a short hiatus, the Attorney General for the state of Illinois, Lisa Madigan, stepped in and became the counterparty whom we negotiated a reform plan with, which resulted similarly in a federal consent decree that Chicago is still under. And then most recently this summer, Alyssa and I and several others at our firm represented the U.S. Conference of Mayors, specifically the Working Group on Police Reform and Racial Justice, which was chaired by Lori Lightfoot, the current mayor of Chicago. And the idea there was to develop a roadmap and concrete suggestions that its member cities, its membership consists of about 1,400 cities. It's a bipartisan organization, so that all the medium and large cities in the country, to come up with a concrete reform plan that member cities could implement. And one of the premises of that project was that the mayors and local governments are where the action is, because policing is really, at the end of the day, a retail issue. Number two, the mayors and local governments have the ability to get something done. And number three, I think it's fair to say that the police department is oftentimes a black box to civilian government. Everybody knows that the police play an important function, but how to approach them and achieve meaningful change is not at all clear to many city executives and city leadership. At the end of July, the conference so we helped write the report for the working group. And then at the end of July, the conference adopted it unanimously and made it its official policy. Thank you.
Alyssa?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be brief. I think Brent has covered everything beautifully. I'm a counsel here in our New York office, so be assured this is a New York representation in part. I've worked with Brent on both the Chicago and Baltimore investigations. As he mentioned, that was really not just an investigation in the sense of responding, but also really helping both of those cities, both of those departments move forward with their reform efforts. And most recently this summer, I worked with him and the rest of our team to draft this report with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, coming up with some concrete suggestions for cities to move forward, providing them with a toolkit of model policies, other resources that they can go to.
Thank you. Just before you go forward, Vice President Lightfoot, I wanted to, Rochester is a member of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and we did sign on to the proposal that was prepared by Mayor Lightfoot. I did have time to speak with her earlier this week as well. And, she also pointed to the report from the U.S. Conference of Mayors and, the team that worked on that. I think that one thing to note as you're going to go into questions is something that I think that we, a little bit brushed over. And that is the fact that, we don't know what the DOJ is going to do. Even though I've already sent a letter to the DOJ asking them to do a review, I'm not sure if they will come in and do a review of our police department. And I don't think that we can wait. I think that we definitely need to start the process as soon as possible, and having a team like this to assist us with the review and doing a deep dive into our policies, our practices, our procedures, as well as our training, and how we are reviewing our body-worn camera footage and other things is something that I am asking this council to really take a look at. And I don't again think that there's a team that we can put together that can do this as expeditiously, because I don't believe that our team or our city can wait for the DOJ to do an extensive review. I believe that we can do both at the same time. It's not an either or, it's a both and, as far as I'm concerned. So turning it over to you, Danielle, I think that you had something else to say, and then I can turn it back over to the Vice President.
Great. And Mayor Warren, I just wanted to put a finer point on what you just mentioned about the Department of Justice. I think that certainly John and I can sort of speak to the political realities right now in the Department of Justice leadership and how it changed over from the Obama administration, obviously, to the Trump administration. The front office of this Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice doesn't have an appetite for pattern or practice investigations and doing this kind of work. They've all but sort of shut those processes down. Now, obviously, if the election goes Joe Biden's way and we're looking at new department leadership in January, it may be something that they consider then, possibly. But, in a case like that, certainly that's something that are well positioned to assist the city with, in light of the work that Brent described with respect to what we did for Chicago, Puerto Rico, and the city of Baltimore. But in the meantime, we would do essentially what DOJ would do, but a lot quicker, and could come in very quickly and start taking a look at the police department's policies, practices, training, what policies are missing, which ones are there but need to be augmented, in a way that would typically take DOJ, even if they did open this kind of investigation, typically a year or more to do.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, Danielle, Alyssa, John, and Brent. It's a pleasure meeting you. I've gone over the document that was sent for the proposal and the 3-point proposal: Strategic Council, Police Department Review, Recommendations for Reform and Implementation. I too would agree that as we look, as one of the members on the Race Commission, joined with another member of mine, Dr. Gruber, that this is one of the things that has been significantly brought up in various conversations about looking at our policy, practices, and procedures. And I can't think of how we could put a team together with this type of expertise, working in other cities as you have, with the expertise that you have. So my first question before I open it up to the rest of the council members is the bottom line question, which I think most people would want to know is, what is this going to cost us? To retain you, what is it going to cost?
So I'll take that question first, and then would love for Brent and John to weigh in also, which is, let me start by saying that we would love to help the city of Rochester and the Rochester Police Department of this. We would love to help you all with this and don't want to let cost stand in the way. I mean, we are a law firm, and so we are expensive. That said, I am confident that we can come up with a structure that makes sense. The way that we've been thinking about this project is sort of a phased approach, which Brent can walk through, and there may be sort of flat fees that we can figure out for different phases of the project, or some sort of blended hourly rate to get the rates down. I think if you all do ultimately want to retain us, we can go back to our finance committee and come up with a proposal for you on cost. Frankly, it's just hard to ballpark exactly what it would be without a sort of clearly defined scope before us on exactly what you want done. But once we have that, we can go back and come up with a structure that makes sense.
So one of the things that we spoke about, and then I can turn it over to the rest of the team, is sort of a concierge approach. And so that they will put together a phased in approach and say, for phase one, and we would do these things in phase one, it would cost this amount. For phase two, it would cost this amount. And so we would work, off of that. And so I think that, it's something that they're definitely, I told them that, we're in the wake of COVID. We don't have a whole lot of money, we're a struggling city, but they are willing to work with us to come up with a plan that and that we shouldn't let the finances of it all deter us from doing what we need to do on behalf of our citizens.
Questions opened up for council members. Councilmember Lachey Harris.
Lachey, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Vice President Lightfoot. I'm very excited to hear about this proposed partnership, or this proposed this proposal. I'd like to ask a question about, you mentioned something about you guys will go over the recruitment, de-escalation training, and I would like to know, do you guys have any history with looking at background practices? For example, the recruitment and psychological exams. We found, at least here in Rochester, I believe those are things that we need to look at when it comes to recruitment for the police department.
Brent, do you want to take that one?
So the answer is that recruitment comes up in every one of these matters for a number of reasons. Typically what happens in these cities is the pendulum swings, and all of a sudden there's a crime surge. There's pressure to hire more officers. Officers are hired. Sometimes the standards are lowered, or they're not as enforced as much as they should. And then that brings in problems. The second aspect of this, of course, is the demographic makeup of who is actually works in the police department is critical. In Baltimore, for example, I'm not sure I have the exact right statistic, but it was something like 75% of the officers were from outside of the city and really didn't know the city and didn't live in the city, which obviously is a significant problem. And then, of course, the racial makeup of the force is critical. And as Mayor Lightfoot in Chicago has said, in the context of discussions about defunding the police, well, if we defunded the police and reduced the force, the first people to go will be the last ones hired because of the way the seniority system works. And those are oftentimes the minority or the diverse officers that the department needs. So I think recruitment and the makeup of the force is just critical to solving the long-term problems and the culture problems inside the police department. One veteran of the Civil Rights Division, the Department of Justice, I remember her response to a criticism that as a result of all these reforms, a lot of officers would quit was, well, maybe it's not such a bad thing that some of the officers who don't really want to be there and part of the reform plan actually leave so we can change the department. And by no means do I mean in any way to disparage the vast majority of officers who want to do the right thing. But recruitment and who you ultimately hire is just critical. Now, I think in some of that depends on your civil service laws as to how you can change that, and hiring practices, what kind of tests can be administered, and things of that sort. So it's not a just wave the wand and solve the recruitment problem. And then, of course, there is a problem nowadays of can you find enough people who want to be police officers, which is a challenge in the current situation, but it is vital.
Thank you.
I'm just looking for hands. Councilmember Dr. Gruber. And then Councilperson Lupien. Dr. Gruber.
Thanks. I have a couple questions, but I'm just going to start with one. So it feels to me like a lot of the conversation around reform doesn't necessarily take into account the fact that right now the actual structure of what 911 calls traditional armed police officers are sent to. I don't think reform by itself gets to the heart of that. I think, and even I think it was you, Brent, talked about a number of cases that it's the case, the tragic case of Mr. Prude is not necessarily an outlier. There have been so many cases like this over the years, and it sounds like your firm has worked on a lot of those, or the individuals here have worked on a lot of those cases. Reform itself is not going to go far enough if every time an instance like this happens, people lean into saying that they're following the protocols and procedures. Part of what we have to do is actually begin to delineate what the right ways to respond to 911 calls are. And I'm wondering what experience you folks have in that work versus just reforming existing policies, practices, and procedures.
I can take that one. So it is a great question. This is a subject that we addressed in the mayor's conference report in the context of defunding the police. What the conference said was, look, defunding the police means different things to different people. But the one thing that it ought to mean is we should collect data on our 911 calls, our 411 calls, and 311 calls, and from other sources to see where we are actually spending officer time. And we should ask the question, when do we actually need somebody in a uniform, a gun, and a badge to show up? And when is that an event that could be handled either with a co-responder model, such as an officer and a social worker, or a mental health professional, or when can we just avoid having the cops show up at all? There was a piece that appeared in the summer in the New York Times by two gentlemen who used to work for the New Orleans Police Department, who now do a lot of data analytics. And they made a couple of points. The first point was that actually many police departments don't even collect the data, which is ironic if you think about the role of statistics now in professional basketball or football or Moneyball and baseball. The police departments don't actually even collect the data in the first place to look at it, just to ask questions. When do we actually need to show up? Two, they determined based on available data for some 10 or so police departments that only about 1% to 4% of calls for service involved violent crime. The rest of it involved things like responding to false alarms, traffic accidents, paperwork, and mental health issues. So whether those are the right statistics for Rochester or not is not really the point. The question is, well, once you know that, then can you redeploy your forces in a smarter way than you're actually using them? But only the biggest police departments are just now beginning to do this kind of analysis. Many police departments have programs like CompStat where they're aggregating data on where all the car thefts occurring, and so let's flood officers into that zone and so forth. But that is really a different kind of analysis than let's just look at our calls for service and ask some basic questions. Maybe we don't actually need police officers to show up at every traffic accident because most of them don't require an officer. Only the most serious ones do, for example. So I think it is a great question. Cities don't do enough of this. And it is exactly, in my view, what every city ought to be doing.
And that could be, in other words, that could be, or you're proposing that it should be part of the scope of work that you all do here. Because I think that, I hope, I'm sure in talking to Mayor Warren, you've heard plenty about the Race Commission, which she's put together with the county executive to do a lot of this work. And that's actually been one of my big fears about the commission, is that the amount of kind of in-depth work that needs to be done on truly assessing where calls for service have come from and where they ought to be going is, beyond the scope of 21 volunteer commissioners. Even though we have a small contract with a research organization, that's work that not only would you guys be able to do in terms of looking at the data, but you'd also be able to put together some policy recommendations to go in conjunction with it.
So just so I can jump in here, Brent, I actually received a letter, Councilman Gruber, from the Race Commission today, asking that if we were going to do this deep dive and this data analysis, to actually have the team share it with the Race Commission. And so I fully intend on doing that. I did not write them back yet because I wanted to make sure that council was satisfied with this group and us looking at the scope. But the plan is to really do this in conjunction with and have it be a part of the Race Commission's final report. And that's why I think that it's very important that we move expeditiously and start to look at these, what we're doing now, especially in light of the fact that, come January, February of next year, we're going to be moving into budget. And so we want to make sure that we have some data, some information, some changes that we can account for in the next budget, and what processes and procedures and where we want to go, and disaggregate some of this data and information for us to be able to do that with our within our police department's budget.
Thanks, Mayor. Can I just ask?
Hold on one second, Dr. Gruber. And I know I'm going to Councilman Lupien in a minute. I don't want to capture this follow-up question that I think is very important, because you just said that you would hope, Mayor, that this this firm would be able to have their work done and be in conjunction with the Race Commission. So just because we're on that commission and we know that timeline is January, February, my question would be to the firm, would that timeline fit for what the work that they would expect to do with us? Would they be able to meet that timeline, or would it be before, or would it be around the same timeline as the Race Commission of being able to have their deep dive done by January, February?
And Willie, can I just ask an addendum to your question, which is where I was going to go anyways? I think the timeline question is important. I also want to understand from the scope of work, is WilmerHale talking about not only being able to do a deep dive of the data, but also making policy recommendations in conjunction with that?
So with respect to the data, I think it's important to be realistic about what can be done. I think we can help devise a plan for looking at your data, but the issues here are, as an initial matter, well, what data do you have already? What form is it in? There are problems in other cities with ideally you just have a dashboard and you'd call it all up and you'd see, oh, I see we spent 10% of our time on false alarm calls. But oftentimes the data is in a form that has to be aggregated, has to be sorted, has to be analyzed, and is a major impediment to actually doing a data analysis. And the cities that do this end up hiring data analytical persons to actually conduct the review. So it would not be realistic to say that we could do an analysis of your data by January or February. What we could do, though, is help you devise, as part of phase one, a plan for how to go about that.
Councilmember, Councilmember Lupien, we can come back to others, but Councilmember Lupien.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. So, you know, hearing that couldn't do the data by January, February, what's the total timeframe for this process and all of the phases?
So
Go ahead, Brent. Because I do think
Yeah.
I do think a lot of this depends on what the exact scope we nail down is. I mean, I think we'd have to sort of get alignment on, you know, the scope of our actual project. But Brent can walk you through the phases, at least, of how we've been thinking about it.
Okay.
Yeah, so first I want to say that it's important for us to be humble about what we know about your city, which is at this point largely what's available in the public record or what we've read about in the news. And one size does not fit all. So we do not want to be the ones who just ride in and start telling everybody their business without knowing much at all about your own police department or your community. That said, and so we need to develop a plan with you that makes sense for you. That said, there are some common problems in these police departments that I would propose as candidates for priority review. Number one, 80% of the problems in all police departments involve use of force. That may seem obvious, but is not necessarily so. I understand that the Rochester Police Department revised its policies around 2015 or 2016 and updated them in February earlier this year. I've taken a look at what is available online, and I see some good things in those policies, but I see some things that are missing. For example, I don't see a requirement that the force respect the sanctity of life, which is often included in modern use of force policies. And by that, I mean the sanctity of all life, a life of a citizen, of a suspect, of an arrestee, of somebody who is in custody. Of course, you can just stick that into your policy and it doesn't do a damn bit of good if officers are not trained on it. So a second priority area for review is training. And I touched on this when we talked about Chicago. It's easy to pile a whole bunch of requirements on police officers, and anybody can print out a policy because they're all over the web and say, hey, this is your new policy, follow it. But if you don't have officer buy-in, or they don't understand what they're supposed to do, and you don't have really good training on how to apply that in novel situations out on the street, that also is not worth anything. I don't know if there's a question. I don't mean to cut anybody off. So training is critical. And in the Chicago example that I mentioned, the training that we devised, we did with help from Training Leadership in Los Angeles, which has a very robust training program that they implemented following the incident involving Rodney King way back in the 90s, because they decided they never wanted to be in that situation again, along with some funding assistance from the Department of Justice and some outside consultants. And the old training model is basically a bunch of PowerPoints on the Fourth Amendment for officers and a bunch of lectures. Oftentimes, the training academy is where is the backwater of the police department, and it's the place where funding first gets cut. Here, we created a program with the Chicago Police Department and the others I mentioned to implement role-based training, scenario-based training, where officers would be confronted with situations and then had to react, and then they would be critiqued, and they'd be critiqued by their peers. Members from the community came in and talked to officers about what was important to them, and educated officers on specific community issues, so they would be culturally more literate. everybody in the police department that went out on the street was required to take this training. It took about a year to implement. It was quite successful. The officers loved it. This is the first time I've ever been given the tools on how to do my job. I haven't had training since I left the police academy. They saw it as a way to keep themselves safe and stay off of YouTube. And so it was really well done, and I think very successful. So training is critical, I think, to turning around police departments and avoiding these problems, and can be a real win-win. A third priority area to look at, again, I'm just proposing these as candidates with only little information, are your policies and practices on responding to mental health crisis. And I think we all know, we all saw what happened on the video, and we all know that a high proportion of calls involve people in mental health with having mental health issues. And even if they don't have any mental health history, oftentimes this is the worst day of their lives when they're coming in contact with the police, and are not mentally at their best. And so what is the appropriate way to deal with those situations? We talked with the mayor about a terrible incident in Chicago where there was a call for service for an adult male who had mental issues and was acting out with a baseball bat, and the police showed up and shot him, and then they shot the person who called the police. There's a whole lot of other specifics that I'm leaving out, but that perhaps could have been handled in a completely different way. It was known that this person had issues, and now many police departments are targeting having a third of the force trained with 8 hours in crisis intervention training, as well as having a roster of mental health professionals available who can respond as needed. So those are 3 priority candidates that I would suggest for consideration for phase 1. There are many other things that we could talk about as well, and so I don't think we want to make any final decisions right here in this forum, but there is a need for action in the city immediately, and so those I think would be at the top of the list for consideration.
Maybe, because the question was, and I appreciate all the information, the question was more around the time frame. Maybe giving an example, for example, Chicago, like how long did it take to do what you did in Chicago?
Well, the Chicago matter, from the death of Laquan McDonald, the involvement of the Department of Justice in negotiation of a consent decree, was probably 3 to 4 years. Okay. That is a different situation than what we're talking about here, but because it started with an investigation and ended with a negotiated settlement agreement.
And
okay.
if I could offer a sort of a counter example or a different example on the Aurora matter that we did earlier this year, was much more focused, and this kind of goes to the question of phasing this and focusing principally on what the city council, the mayor's office feels is the most important set of issues to address. There, in about 3 months, we came out with a variety of recommendations on a much narrower slice of issues, mind you, than what Brent is describing, but focusing in on accountability and review of misconduct issues, and very specific set of questions. So to the extent that we are able to define with you sort of phases that have particular elements that can be addressed, we can move much more quickly. I think one thing that, and just to echo where Brent, I think, has been going, and I know Danielle and I have talked about as well, is that we don't see this as a single work product to you all, but something that focuses on the city's need to act, and to act rapidly and effectively in making changes and taking your lead on what the top priority items might be, including mental health issues, which Brent just mentioned, training, and the whole variety of issues. One issue that I know is very important from my point of view, and Brent has experienced it, Danielle very much so, is making sure that whatever recommendations that we offer to you come along with a sense of how officers in the department is going to be held accountable. To go back to your question, Councilmember Gruber, earlier on, when we talk about, policy and practices, I don't think we're approaching this from a really narrow, okay, we're going to look at the paper and just say, oh, this is missing, this is not, you need to phrase this differently. But something that's got to get the buy-in, as Brent is saying, of the actual command staff of the police department, but also has to think broadly about what's really going to work for the city and for the people of the city of Rochester. So those are my points, really echoing what Brent is saying and trying to put this in context on the timing issue specifically.
Thanks. I'll just ask one more question before I turn it over. We have a police accountability board that is also charged with, making recommendations around policy and procedures. And, I think this question is more for my colleagues and for the mayor. How is this complement or duplicate those, the role that the police accountability board has?
From my perspective, it doesn't duplicate or complicate what the Police Accountability Board is doing. I think that they would work alongside the Police Accountability Board, given the fact that they have the expertise to really look at these policies and procedures and to really do a deep dive to, tell us what data we should be looking at, what data we should be collecting, how if we don't, I don't know if we have the data that, Brent was just talking about. We would need to talk to Nick Petiti and say, and see if 911 and other places are collecting this data, and we just haven't aggregated it yet. So I think that on the scope of it, it's to say, we need to really have people that know exactly how to evaluate and do a deep dive and work alongside those people that are in the community that have the community voice. And I think that that's exactly what they're talking about. The PAB has the community voice, they have the community understanding, and they can be working alongside with them and saying, like, look, this policy or procedure that is currently written is not something that we really support. We think that it should be different in this way. And they can work with them to do that. And so I think that there's enough room at the table for everyone in this discussion, but it's being led by people that have evaluated police departments before. And also one of the things that we didn't talk about and they didn't talk about is really working with state legislatures to implement different legislative changes that may need to take place. As you all know, we have the union contract, we also have state laws and other things that may preclude us from doing certain things, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at it. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't advocate for change. And we would need people like the PAB and other folks to join with us to go to the state to do those things. And so I think that this is in addition to what the PAB is doing, and it would help them with their work because they're a group of volunteers as well. And so they can say, listen, this is what we've been thinking about and what we want you to look at. And it's the same with the Race Commission as well. So I think that these different community voices will have a seat at the table and working alongside with these experts, but they're going to need somebody with the expertise to actually do the work and do the deep dive for them and bring it back for them to have some sort of buy-in and on these recommendations.
So before we go to Councilmember Patterson, I just want to clear something for the record. I think Councilmember Lupien said, could it complement? So I think not complicate. So I think you're right, Mayor, that this it would complement the work that the Police Accountability Board is doing. So Councilmember Patterson. We can't hear you, sir.
We can't hear you. I'm sorry, you still can't hear you.
Okay,
Mike, if you're in the building, you can actually come to my office and ask your question.
While he works on that, Will.
Dr. Gruber?
Yeah, I want to echo that. Obviously, I think that the work of a group like WilmerHale would only complement the work of the PAB, especially since PAB is in the process right now of kind of growing their capacity. They don't have any staff yet, but certainly that's going to happen soon. I think that would be great, but it leads to a more kind of functional question, Mayor, which is ultimately, I mean, how, I assume at some point you'd like for us to vote on something related to putting WilmerHale on retainer. And I'm wondering how that might work in terms of the actual mechanics of them connecting with both race and PAB. Because certainly the last thing that we need, I think one of the concerns right now is there's so many tables having so many conversations right now. We need to find a way to really coordinate it. Sounds like WilmerHale, I have zero doubts after this conversation, has the expertise to do a lot of that. But how do you actually, maybe you don't have an answer to this yet, Mayor. Maybe it's something we'll wait to see it in legislation. But do you have a sense of how you expect to kind of connect all these dots with WilmerHale, an outside entity, as the kind of glue?
So what I would like to do is bring legislation forth to council once we narrow down what the scope is and the phasing in approaches, right? So, as they have already indicated, this is not going to be everything at once, right? So what are those things that we want to look at first? Whereas the PAB is a lasting organization, right? So that the PAB isn't going away. So they're going to be around, after race. The race is an entity that's set in stone that has like a 6-month window to bring forth plans and procedures. So that particular organization in their proposals, we will hope to have some of the data, some of the information, some of the recommendations from WilmerHale to be included in the work that race is doing in listening to those individuals that are coming before the Race Commission and working on this particular field of criminal justice. But it's a wider span when we're talking about criminal justice, right? So we're talking specifically about the Rochester Police Department. When the Race Commission is looking at it, they're talking about criminal justice as a whole. Rochester Police Department is part of that equation, but it's not the full part of it. You have a DA's office, you have a public defender's office, you have defense attorneys, you have other services that are included in that. And so it's a larger discussion. This is just one piece of the puzzle. And I want to be very clear that what we would be focusing on is the Rochester Police Department, and that's it. Working with the PAB or working in connection or in concert with it is because, now you have an entity that can do the deep dive and the upfront work for the PAB, but the PAB is going to be there, to last for years to come. And so this work would be helpful to them. So that's the way I'm looking at it. And I think that that's how this could complement all the work that we're already doing and bring it all together in a succinct way where you don't have, too many people trying to fit or trying to dictate what should happen here, that the mayor and council can say with WilmerHale, this is what we want to look at. This is phase 1 that we want you to deep dive in. And this is, the time frame that we would like this back at. And, these are the people that we want you to sit down and talk to and work with to, that they have concerns on this particular policy, procedure, training, and all of that. Get that information and go back and bring back a report and also recommendations on how to fix it. It's one thing to point out what the problem is. It's another thing to develop a plan on how we can actually fix and make it work for the citizens of Rochester. And so that's where I think it's very important that we have, an entity that can help us do that and help and have done that before for other cities and made it work for them in a way that it doesn't, reduce the morale of those individuals in our police department, as well as the citizens and the people that live in our city. So it's in concert with one another, working together to make it better for everyone.
Is Councilmember Patterson with you now? Does he want to ask his question?
He said that he was good.
Okay. Any other, for the sake of time, I just want to acknowledge that Council President Loretta Scott could not join us. So we just wanted to acknowledge that. And we also are missing a couple other council members, Councilmember Pio and Councilmember Evans also could not attend and join us, but we'll make sure that we send this link, get them this information so they can review this conversation that we've had. Any other questions as we get ready to close? Councilmember Lupien.
I know we touched on the concept of defunding. Does your firm have a position on that, or is it more situational? If that makes sense.
So the firm doesn't have a position as the firm. I described what the position of the conference was, but to make it explicit, the conference unequivocally said they were against defunding the police, that the police play a vital role. Obviously, you are the leaders of Rochester, so you can make whatever decisions you want to make. But the conference position was they were against defunding the police, but that it made a whole lot of sense to look at what and how police departments are actually using their resources. And perhaps the problem is that we ask police to do too much, and whether there is a better way to use our resources. And that is what led to them to recommend an analysis of 911 and other data and resources. The commissioner of Baltimore, the police commissioner of Baltimore, has had a line that he uses, which is, look, before we rip down our current stadium, they have a big stadium in Baltimore, before we rip down the current stadium, we need a new stadium in its place. And so it's incumbent upon the city and the leadership of the police department to decide what that new stadium would look like and what is a smart way to use its resources. So that is the conference position. And again, it's up to you all to decide how you want to proceed with that question.
All right, thanks. We're getting ready to close here, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank WilmerHale, Brent, Danielle, John, Elisa for your in-depth review of your firm and the proposal that you presented to us. I want to thank the mayor for presenting this proposal to us and this idea. Clearly, our city has had a lot of civil unrest. However, I think that there's a lot more that we can agree on than we disagree on. And I think that those key pieces that you just presented, I think we all can agree that we need to reimagine how policing is done in our community. So I think we all agree on that, right? So with that being said, Madam Mayor, if you have any final comments, and if not, then we'll close out.
So I think that Danielle wanted to say something really quick, and then
Sure.
Okay.
I just wanted to thank you all for your time and listen, I do think, just to echo John and Brent's point, we will scope this in a way that makes sense for you all, and can do it on the timeline that you need it done. And so once we get to a place where you've determined these are our key priorities, like making sure that we've got the right de-escalation policies and training in place for interacting with individuals with mental health issues. If that's number one, we tackle that first, and we could get a timeline for that. So we'll work at your pace and would love to assist.
Thank you. I think we're going to have a lot more conversations around this. Also want to acknowledge our Deputy Mayor, James Smith, who's also on the call as well, too. Madam Mayor.
Thank you all for your time. Thank you, Council, for your time. We will continue to work with WilmerHale and try to develop a scoping mechanism. It would be helpful to me, Vice President Lightfoot, if you and your committee could send over some of the things that you would like for WilmerHale to address in phase one. And so I can make sure that they get that as part of their, phased in approach and looking at what the cost will be. And then we'll be able to move expeditiously. I think that this is something that we definitely, given the time constraints, given the fact that, we have the Race Commission going on, the PAB is looking at their work as well, that it would be, prudent for us to actually engage with them sooner rather than later. And so I would love to be bringing legislation to you within the next couple of weeks to actually retain them and work with them. But I would definitely need that information from you all about what the scope and what things that you want them to look at in phase one, so that we can get a proposal that we're all satisfied with.
We'll work on it, Madam Mayor. We'll have conversations with Council President Loretta Scott. I'm sure she will get our great staff, Katie and BJ, on making sure that we engage all of our council members with an email to get us their recommendations, and we'll consolidate that down to 3 to 5 that we have as a council as a whole. And I'm sure Madam President will lead us in that effort. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And I know that they, in their proposal, in their 4-page proposal, had already outlined a couple things that I think is in line with what council spoke about today. So I think that we're already sort of there. One of the recommendations is what Councilmember Gruber had outlined, which is the data, and we can definitely look at that. All right, everyone have a great day.
Take care.
Great,
Nice.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Take care. Be safe.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.